The Dwarf with the Long Beard, Part 2. Slavic Folktale. Prince Dobrotek leapt onto the dappled horse, which was covered with golden trappings, and they set off immediately, clearing mountains, penetrating forests, crossing rivers, and so light was the steed's step that he galloped over the grass without bending a single blade, and along sandy roads without raising a grain of dust. At last they reached a vast plain, strewn with human bones. They stopped in front of a huge moving mountain, and the horse said, "Prince, this moving mountain that you see before you is the head of the monster with basilisk eyes, and the bones that whiten the ground are the skeletons of his victims, so beware of the eyes that deal death. The heat of the midday sun has made the giant sleep, and the sword with the never-failing blade lies there before him. Bend down and lie along my neck until we are near enough, then seize the sword and you have nothing more to fear, for, without the sword, not only will the monster be unable to harm you, but he himself will be completely at your mercy." The horse then noiselessly approached the huge creature, upon which the prince bent down, and quickly picked up the sword. Then, raising himself on his steed's back, he gave a hurrah, loud enough to wake the dead. The giant lifted his head, yawned, and turned his bloodthirsty eyes upon the prince, but seeing the sword in his hand he became quiet, and said, "Knight, is it weariness of life that brings you here?" "Boast not," replied the prince, "you are in my power, your glance has already lost its magic charm, and you will soon have to die by this sword, but first tell me who you are." "It is true, Prince, I am in your hands, but be generous, I deserve your pity. I am a knight of the race of giants, and if it were not for the wickedness of my brother I should have lived in peace. He is the horrible dwarf with the great hump and the beard 7 feet long. He was jealous of my fine figure, and tried to do me an injury. You must know that all his strength, which is extraordinary, lies in his beard, and it can only be cut off by the sword you hold in your hand. One day he came to me and said, 'Dear brother, I pray you help me to discover the sharp smiting sword that has been hidden in the earth by a magician. He is our enemy, and he alone can destroy us both.' Thoughtful that I was, I believed him, and by means of a large oak tree, raked up the mountain and found the sword. Then we disputed as to which of us should have it, and at last my brother suggested that we should cease quarreling and decide by lot. 'Let us each put an ear to the ground, and the sword shall belong to him who first hears the bells of yonder church,' said he. I placed my ear to the ground at once, and my brother treacherously cut off my head with the sword. My body, left unburied, became a great mountain, which is now overgrown with forests. As for my head, it is full of a life and strength proof against all dangers, and has remained here ever since to frighten all who attempt to take away the sword. Now, Prince, I beg of you, use the sword to cut off the beard of my wicked brother, kill him, and return here to put an end to me. I shall die happy if I die avenged." "That you shall be, and very soon, I promise you," replied his listener. The prince bade the dappled horse with golden mane carry him to the kingdom of the dwarf with the long beard. They reached the garden gate at the very moment when the dwarf had caught sight of Princess Piatnaka and was running after her. The war trumpet, challenging him to fight, had obliged him to leave her, which he did, having first put on her head the invisible cap. While the prince was awaiting the answer to his challenge he heard a great noise in the clouds, and looking up saw the dwarf preparing to aim at him from a great height, but he missed his aim and fell to the ground so heavily that his body was half buried in the earth. The prince seized him by the beard, which he at once cut off with a sharp smiting sword. Then he fastened the dwarf to the saddle, put the beard in his helmet, and entered the palace. When the servants saw that he had really got possession of the terrible beard, they opened all the doors to give him entrance. Without losing a moment he began his search for Princess Piatnaka. For a long time he was unsuccessful, and was almost in despair when he came across her accidentally, and, without knowing it, knocked off the invisible cap. He saw his lovely bride sound asleep, and being unable to wake her he put the cap in his pocket, took her in his arms, and, mounting his steed, set off to return to the monster with the basilisk eyes. The giant swallowed the dwarf at one mouthful, and the prince cut the monster's head up into 1,000 pieces, which he scattered all over the plain. He then resumed his journey, and on coming to the moorland the dappled horse stopped short and said, "Prince, here for the present we must take leave of each other. You are not far from home, your own horse awaits you, but before leaving, enter in at my right ear and come out at my left." The prince did so, and came out without his armor, and clad as when Piatnatka left him. The dappled horse vanished, and Dobrotek whistled to his own horse, who ran up, quite pleased to see him again. They immediately set off for the king's palace. But night came on before they reached the end of their journey. The prince laid the sleeping maiden on the grass, and, covering her up carefully to keep her warm, he himself fell fast asleep. By chance, a knight, one of her suitors, passed that way. Seeing Dobrotek asleep, he drew his sword and stabbed him. Then he lifted the princess on his horse and soon reached the king's palace, where he addressed Piatnatka as father in these words: "Here is your daughter, whom I now claim as my wife, for it is I who have restored her to you. She was carried off by a terrible sorcerer who fought with me 3 days and 3 nights, but I conquered him, and I have brought you the princess safely back." The king was overjoyed at seeing her again, but finding that his tenderest efforts were powerless to awake her, he wanted to know the reason of it. "That I cannot tell you," replied the impostor, "you see her as I found her myself." Meanwhile, poor Prince Dobrotek, seriously wounded, was slowly recovering consciousness, but he felt so weak that he could hardly utter these words. "Come, magic horse with mane of gold! Come, dappled horse, oh come to me! Fly like the birds as you did of old! As flashes of lightning o'er land and sea!" Instantly a bright cloud appeared, and from the midst thereof stepped the magic horse. As he already knew all that had happened, he dashed off immediately to the mountain of eternal life. Thence he drew the 3 kinds of water: the water that gives life, the water that cures, and the water that strengthens. Returning to the prince, he sprinkled him first with the life-giving water, and instantly the body, which had become cold, was warm again and the blood began to circulate. The water that cures healed the wound, and the strength-giving water had such an effect upon him that he opened his eyes and cried out, "Oh, how well I have slept!" "You were already sleeping the eternal sleep," replied the dappled horse. "One of your rivals stabbed you mortally, and carried off Piatnatka, whom he pretends to have rescued. But do not worry yourself, she still sleeps, and none can arouse her but you, and this you must do by touching her with the dwarf's beard. Go now, and be happy." The brave steed disappeared in a whirlwind, and Prince Dobrotek proceeded on his way. On drawing near the capital he saw it surrounded by a large foreign army. Part of it was already taken, and the inhabitants seemed to be begging for mercy. The prince put on his invisible cap, and began to strike right and left with the sharp smiting sword. With such fury did he attack the enemy that they fell dead on all sides, like felled trees. When he had thus destroyed the whole army he went, still invisible, into the palace, where he heard the king express the utmost astonishment that the enemy had retired without fighting. "Where then is the brave warrior who has saved us?" said his majesty aloud. Every one was silent, when Dobrotek took off his magic cap, and falling on his knees before the monarch, said, "It is I, my king and father, who have routed and destroyed the enemy. It is I who saved the princess, my bride. While on my way back with her I was treacherously killed by my rival, who has represented himself to you as her rescuer, but he has deceived you. Lead me to the princess, that I may awaken her." On hearing these words the impostor ran away as quickly as possible, and Dobrotek approached the sleeping maiden. He just touched her brow with the dwarf's beard, upon which she opened her eyes, smiled, and seemed to ask where she was. The king, overcome with joy, kissed her fondly, and the same evening she was married to the devoted Prince Dobrotek. The king himself led her to the altar, and to his son-in-law he gave half his kingdom. So splendid was the wedding banquet, that eye has never seen, nor ear ever heard of its equal. The end.